Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking there's no such place as Baltimore. Professor, you taught me about Baltimore town. You didn't teach me anything about Baltimore. And I like your salty attitude. I like it. And you're absolutely right. It was Baltimore town until 1796, when the Maryland Assembly passed the law you see here, an act to erect Baltimore town into a city and to incorporate the inhabitants thereof. So this is where Baltimore town becomes Baltimore, the city. And under this law from the state government, Baltimore now had its own city court system, its own elected mayor, and its own bicameral city council. Bicameral means it has two chambers to it, like the Maryland Assembly or the U.S. Congress. Yeah, so they're like self-governing. Not fully self-governing, they're part of Maryland, but in a lot of ways to make efficiency and commerce more effective. To make efficiency more effective? Is that what I just said? Let me just try that sentence again because I'm embarrassed by it, okay? To make the operation of the city more efficient and to make commerce flow more smoothly. Baltimore now had more power to govern itself. I feel so much better about that second draft of that sentence. This is why you edit. Unfortunately, it's all preserved on video. Okay, so the guy you see here on this slide is the first elected mayor of Baltimore, James Calhoun. And so in these years, and again, the key term here is Baltimore in the early republic, which you should think of as like the 1790s to the 18 teens. Sometimes people take it all the way to like 1830, but something like that. 1790 to 1820. How's that for a decent time frame? So in 1790, where you remember that was the first U.S. census, Baltimore showed as the 5th biggest city in the new United States, behind New York, Philly, Boston, and Charleston. But 20 years later, 1810, Baltimore had climbed to the 3rd biggest city in the country and was close to Philadelphia for being the 2nd biggest city in the country. So note this incredible growth from 1790 to 1820. Baltimore went from 13,500 to 46,500. And Baltimore was the focus or the center of Maryland's free black population. In 1810, Baltimore had roughly 36,000, I've rounded all these numbers off, but they're close, approximately 36,000 white people, 5,700 slaves, and 4,700 free black people. So there are almost as many free black people as enslaved people. This is a shot of Baltimore in the early 1800s. This picture is actually from 1816, I think, so a little bit later. In this growing, developing city, there was a thriving press. The first Baltimore newspaper was the Maryland Journal and Baltimore Advertiser, established by William Goddard in 1773. The paper, from the time it started, supported the growing push to resist Britain. In 1774, as we'll talk more about in just a minute, he handed the paper over to his sister, and she edited it for a decade. I'm excited anytime I get to say the two words edited it, because I just think it's a lot of fun. So he edited it, and then she edited it. In the graph down here, you can see the total number of newspapers published in Baltimore by year. So through most of this period, there are 5 to 10 different newspapers in just the city of Baltimore. They had different perspectives, different approaches, and it meant that for you as a resident of Baltimore, of course, something similar would be true if you lived in Philadelphia or New York, but as the resident of a big city, you had access to a bewildering array of information. And it was sometimes difficult to tell what was true. There's a lot of information, but which of it do I believe? Of the dozens of papers produced in Baltimore across this time period, the one we already introduced first, the Maryland Journal, was the most important. And it was edited for a decade by Mary Catherine Goddard, who we already talked about back with the Declaration of Independence, because you remember she's the one who printed the Baltimore edition and put her name on it. She edited the Maryland Journal from 1774 to 1784. And that meant she was the editor of the paper during the Peggy Stewart, Lexington and Concord, the Declaration of Independence, the battles of the war. And she used the paper to rally the American cause. She also produced several editions of an almanac from Baltimore, one of which you see over here. And she was the postmaster of Baltimore town from 1775 to 1789. Appointed by the Continental Congress back in 1775, and they pick her because she runs the biggest newspaper in Baltimore. But you see, they didn't not give her the position because she was a woman. And she held that position until the U.S. government was created in 1789. When the U.S. government was created, the new U.S. Postmaster General refused to keep her in the position. Oh, and I should mention, she apparently didn't want to give up the newspaper. Her brother came back to Baltimore and took it. And apparently it was a pretty bitter fight between the two of them. She lived until 1816, but the peak of her sort of power and societal influence had passed. All sorts of new institutions were developing in Baltimore in this period. 1790, the first bank in the state of Maryland, cleverly called the Bank of Maryland, which was established in Baltimore back in 1790. The letter you see here is just a Maryland politician writing to Thomas Jefferson. So we get banks, the first library in the state of Baltimore, not quite a public library, you had to be a member, but still fabulous for the spread of knowledge and information. Banks were critical for facilitating commerce because banks issued paper money. Paper money that the bank then promised to redeem for what was called specie. That's like gold, which was considered to be the real money. But nobody wants to walk around with pockets full of gold. So by banks issuing these paper notes, it allowed everybody to engage in more trade and commerce. So the Bank of Maryland was the first bank, but it was followed by a bunch of other banks. There were also companies that got chartered to build bridges over the Patapsco River and the Jones Falls. The bridges facilitate trade and commerce. There was another company that was chartered to actually pipe water from the Jones Falls into the city of Baltimore, because the local water was undrinkable by this time. You getting a sense of it, right? Like sort of a modern city coming into being. Water systems, banking systems, a police force created in 1797. The police force's, I was going to say their primary job, but I'll amend that just a little bit. One of the police force's primary jobs to police enslaved people in Baltimore. Fires were devastating for big cities. And so you get the Baltimore Fire Insurance Company, created in 1794. And all of these institutions, like, a water company and a fire insurance company, these are the things that allow a growing city to continue to grow. Right? Because you don't want to live in, you may not want to live in a city where when lightning strikes, it burns down 2/3 of the city. And you've got no insurance. The Baltimore Fire Insurance Company put together a fire brigade and also insured people's real estate, right? So they fight the fires and insure what you own. Baltimore's merchants were connected to much of the world. I mean, Baltimore merchants engaged in trade with the French, the Dutch. They traded all the way over to China and what was called the East Indies at the time, which is like, the Philippines and Indonesia. These is just one day of ships arriving in Baltimore. And you can see they're coming from Spain, from the Caribbean, from Norfolk. There were a growing number of factories also in and just outside Baltimore, using water power to power mills, flour mills, lumber mills, and the first textile mill, which starts in the early 1800s. The textile mill is where they're making clothing from cotton fibers. But perhaps the biggest industry in Baltimore was shipbuilding. There were 25 shipbuilding businesses in Baltimore in the early 1800s. They employed, I don't know how many people, but it had to be a great proportion of the city's working class. Shipbuilding, like other Baltimore industries, was integrated. So in these shipbuilding companies, you would find white men, you'd also find free black men, and you'd also find enslaved men. The ships that were made in Baltimore did all sorts of different things once at sea, but one of the most prominent was serving as slave ships. Slave trading vessels made in Baltimore, sometimes with enslaved labor building the ship, and that ship would then travel to Africa, obtain enslaved people, bring them back to America, and sell them in those places where such human trafficking was still legal. Brickmaking was another big industry which, like shipbuilding, appears to have been pretty highly integrated. White laborers and black laborers side by side, free and enslaved laborers side by side. So in Baltimore, more than any other place in Maryland, it could be really tricky to tell who's enslaved and who's free. This runaway slave ad over here, the guy advertising, says that my slave has run away and I know he's going to Baltimore because he has a brother who works as a brickmaker there and he'll be able to conceal him. It's exactly the kind of thing that slave owners worried so much about. Speaking of wanting freedom, in 1793, down here in the Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue, there was a massive slave rebellion. This is the what is today the modern nation of Haiti, but at the time a French sugar plantation slave colony called Saint-Domingue. And here in 1793, in this Caribbean island, enslaved people rose up in a massive slave rebellion. And there was a huge wave of French colonists fleeing Saint-Domingue. And in 1793, a bunch of them arrived in Baltimore. Right? So these are French-speaking, Catholic, quote-unquote, white people fleeing a slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue and coming in desperation to Baltimore. This is an account from the Maryland Gazette talking about how these ships have appeared in Baltimore. And aboard the ships were French masters and their families, but some of them brought their slaves from Saint-Domingue. So before letting them off their ships, the Baltimore government inspected them. And many of these French refugees from a slave rebellion that was trying to kill them now took up residence in Baltimore. It added to the kind of diverse, cosmopolitan feel that Baltimore had. It does, however, appear that the French refugees very likely brought the yellow fever outbreak that decimated Baltimore in 1793. So that was unfortunate. The French added to the already vibrant religious diversity in Baltimore. They, of course, were Catholics, and they added to the Catholic population that was already there and had been for a long time. For a while, French Catholics largely worshipped separate from American Catholics, but over time, as the French have children in Baltimore, those French Americans tended to merge together with the longer time Americans. There was also a small but growing Jewish population in Baltimore, and they established the first Jewish cemetery in 1799 after obtaining the land from the Carroll family, who was willing to sell them some land in the interests of, religious toleration and acceptance. There was also the Baltimore Basilica, which was built in 1806 by Baltimore's most prominent architect. And in its overall religious diversity, it appears that only Philadelphia was more religiously diverse than Baltimore, which is pretty impressive because Philadelphia may have been the most religiously diverse place on the planet. So for Baltimore to be number 2 is kind of remarkable if you don't think that religious diversity is terrible, which of course some people did. The image down here shows you how sometimes churches are right across the street from each other, competing with each other for people's religious allegiances. The religious freedom was exciting. It meant that, there were sometimes people on street corners preaching different faiths. It meant that you were free to change your faith whenever you wanted to. You could go to the Unitarian Church, which argues that God doesn't carry out any miracles and that really you've got to figure things out yourself. Or you could go to the Methodist Church, which is very strong on God's miraculous nature. Right? So it's like a marketplace of religious ideas. There were also lots of opportunities for fun and excitement. The Holiday Street Theater, known by lots of other names over its lifespan, was originally constructed in 1796. There, you could get all sorts of theatrical productions. And there were a growing range of hotels to accommodate visitors and merchants in the city. Baltimore was home to the first Maryland Medical School. The College of Medicine of Maryland, which I always think is kind of a weird title, established by the Maryland Assembly in 1807, and then designed by Maryland's most famous architect, who is here once again. The building opened in 1812 and later became part of the University of Maryland. So the building is depicted here. Part of today the University of Maryland's system across the state. There were artists who could paint a landscape for you, like Francis Guy. This incredible painting of the Baltimore landscape. Francis Guy, you could also hire him to come paint your estate outside Baltimore, like this one. Now, Francis Guy is based in Baltimore, right? But he'll come out to your country estate, paint it for you for a handsome price. The most prominent portrait artist in Baltimore appears to have been Joshua Johnston, who was, it seems pretty clear, not white. In this ad for his work, he tells people that he's a self-taught genius who has experienced many insuperable obstacles in the pursuit of his studies. It appears that he was very light-skinned. This is not a portrait of Joshua Johnston. This is a portrait that Joshua Johnston painted of an African-American seaman. But most of the portraits he painted were of white Baltimoreans. And this is some of Joshua Johnston's work. You don't need the people. These are just some of Joshua Johnston's portraiture. Maximilian Godefroy was the second most prominent architect in Baltimore. He designed some of these images I've shown you before. He designed the first Unitarian Church. That was Godefroy's work. And he designed St. Mary's Seminary Chapel, which opened in 1808. But the most important architect, who I've alluded to a few times already, was Benjamin Latrobe, who built the Baltimore Basilica, the Merchants Exchange Building, which opened in 1820, and that building for the College of Medicine. Latrobe was a Maryland architect of national and international renown. Props to Maryland. Next, we'll go through a bit of history where we'll overlap free black Marylanders with Baltimore in the early Republic.